Welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be going back to the 19th century and talking about a very dirty subject, and that is the Guano Islands Act of 1856. And Chris, when you talk about history you didn't know, and maybe history you didn't want to know, the Guano Islands Act of 1856 probably hits the top of that list.
Yeah, I would say that there's very few podcasts that talk about excrement. It's probably not a topic of necessarily polite conversation, but it's fundamental, it's unavoidable. And Ray, did you know there's even a book that is designed for children, and it's called Everyone Poops. And so we might as well talk about one of the most interesting, probably never heard of bills that ever passed the United States Congress, signed off by a president with ideas of expansion. And it comes to this idea that is centered around bird poop. What a fascinating conversation we're in for today.
Yeah, so let's just get right into it. Of course, when we talk about guano, we're talking about bird droppings. In particular, we're talking about bird droppings that were on these islands, I guess off the west coast of Peru, and not just the west coast of Peru, but also in the Caribbean. And what had happened, I guess, over hundreds or thousands of years is these birds would come to these islands, I guess, to feed or do whatever they did, and they would just poop. And over many, many years, that poop collected. Well, the United States, at this particular point, and not just the United States, but the world, did not have, I guess, what I'm going to call, Chris, artificial fertilizer. So they were still depending on fertilizer from animals. And it was discovered that guano, or these bird droppings, made very good fertilizer.
Yeah, I mean, you got to think, and these are these very small islands that we really find out off the southern coast of Peru, and you have to imagine they're uninhabited. There's nobody living there. There's nobody that's around, and so the birds are they're feeding, they're breeding. They're
dropping.
They have no predators nearby. And get this, Ray, that those droppings that they would accumulate up to a depth of 200 feet.
Yeah.
And you've got the cool ocean currents, you've got the dry weather, and so it's allowing the guano to have this nitrate-rich quality. And if anybody knows anything about trying to get nice green grass in your yard, they always talk about the importance of nitrogen. That nitrogen is something that is extremely helpful to fertilizing the yard. And so as you start seeing America in this expansion mode, as they're moving west, if you will, as they're continuing to explore, they need solid, very good fertilizer. And it just so happened that these small little islands in Peru came to find out that that's where the fertilizer was. And it wasn't just America that was interested. No. All of a sudden, you see this worldwide competition. Britain, Germany, and others who find out that there's good bird poop to be had over there in Peru, and they want to be the first ones to go and get it. And sometimes some of these would wait 8 months just to load up the cargo.
Yeah, and they weren't the first to use guano for fertilizer. Actually, the first civilization to use guano as fertilizer were the Inca. The Inca had found that it was very valuable for fertilizer, and they actually valued it so much that they made laws in their civilization forbidding anyone to hunt seabirds, that is, these birds that were pooping and the poop was collecting, on the penalty of death. So if you killed one of those birds among the Inca, you could find yourself in real deep water. They passed regulation, or they put regulations in place controlling this natural fertilizer, as we would call it. So the United States, Great Britain, many, many years later, are going to get on the guano bandwagon. And you know what? They're going to get the fertilizer they wanted, and Peru, at least for a period of time, is going to make a bundle of money off this. Unfortunately for the Peruvian people, however, that's not going to benefit everyone in Peru. It's sort of going to benefit only a small group of people at the top of the civilization, and it's not going to last.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about 300 ships that would come to these Peruvian islands, and they would wait offshore to load up. And I think it is interesting for our listeners to understand how the process works. We already talked about that sometimes you would see 200 feet accumulation of this guano. And when the loading would start, remember, you would load in the bottom of the ship. And so as they're loading into the bottom of the ship, all the inside doors and the windows are closed, and they're trying to keep, because guano is toxic. The dust is toxic. It can actually cause health issues if you're not careful with it. And so you've got filling the bottom storage areas of the ship with this guano, and loading crews were supposed to only be down there for 20 minutes at a time, and then they needed to go up to the top of the boat to get fresh air and things of that nature. So during this process, we see a lot of people getting sick. We experience a lot of frustration, but the people who are behind the operation, they see money. They see an opportunity to grow rich off of this. And so it's basically a mining operation. You go, you get all that you can get, and once you've gotten all out of that location, you simply go to the next spot, and then the next spot, and then the next spot.
Yeah, and you talk about the money to be had, and you see that even in 1855 when the American Guano Company is formed in, of all places, New York City, where they formed this company, which of course is looking for islands where they can go mine for guano. They can go mine for these bird droppings, and they can charge a lot of money, to sell this to various people. So but going back even further, as far back as 1850, President Millard Fillmore of the United States, in his 1850 State of the Union address, he addresses the issue of Peruvian guano, and he says, quote, "It has become so desirable an article to the agricultural interest of the United States that it is the duty of the government to employ all the means properly in its power for the purpose of causing that article to be," the article there being bird poop, "to be imported into the country at a reasonable price. Nothing will be admitted on my part toward accomplishing this desirable end. I am persuaded that in removing any restraints on this traffic, the Peruvian government will promote its own best interest, while it will afford a proof of a friendly disposition toward this country, which will be duly appreciated." So you had the President of the United States in 1850 promoting this in his State of the Union address. By 1855, you have the American Guano Company in New York City. So the United States is getting on this bandwagon, not going to be left behind by Britain and other countries. So the Guano Islands Act was passed on August 18, 1856. And it's interesting, Chris, what this law actually allows the U.S. government to do, because I don't want to quote a lot of stuff here, but I do think we need to quote this. It says, quote, "that when any citizen or citizens of the United States may have discovered or shall hereafter discover a deposit of guano on any island, rock, or key not within the lawful jurisdiction of any other government and not occupied by citizens of any other government, and shall take peaceable possession thereof and occupy the same said island, rock, or key, may the discretion of the President of the United States be considered as appertaining to the United States," end quote. Basically, what this particular act allowed, Chris, and what the President of the United States in 6 years earlier had sort of promoted, was the idea that the United States is going to go out to these islands, and if nobody else is out there and nobody else has claimed it, we're going to claim it, not in the name of creating a colony or a state or anything like that, but just simply in the name of mining for the poop on those islands.
Yeah, and go a step further, because usually when we think about conquering a territory or an island, we think of it in the form of maybe a war effort, or we're going over there to help another country to get situated, or whatever it might be. But when this law was announced, it basically said that if Ray Shepard came across an island that was not under any control by any other country, and you saw that it had bird poop, then you could claim that island under your name for the sole purpose of getting bird poop. And we have to keep that in mind. This was not a military thing. This was not a government thing. This was any citizen could claim an island. And Ray, more than 100 islands around the globe were claimed this way, including a lot of islands that you and I never heard about, don't even know where they're located. But one of them that we might be familiar with, especially as we look a little later with war and other things, was Midway Island. And so here you have individual citizens, part of a company sometimes, maybe not part of a company, but if you just came upon a random island and after research found out that it's available, and my gosh, there's guano, you could absolutely take it. And you say, well, let's think about this. Not everybody was really wanting to use it for fertilizer. And you're right, not everybody wanted to use it for fertilizer. There was actually a study done that said that the properties of guano, which leads to this guano mania, if you will, that the properties could be made into a homeopathic medicine for human consumption. So get this, that in 1854...
That's disturbing.
You might want to find guano because it will help you from violent headaches. It will help you if you have the itching of the nostrils, if you have the itching of the back of the thighs and other areas. It was helpful for if you had any type of symptom related to hay fever, ingest a little bit of guano and you'd feel a little better. I don't believe it, but that's what they say.
Yeah, it's interesting also because it's like it was toxic.
Right.
But at the same time, if you got a sneeze, you can take this and it might help you. But one thing that's amazing to me, Chris, you emphasized, and I think rightly so, that this is not a military operation. But you go back to 1850, and Millard Fillmore is saying, look, to the Peruvian government in his State of the Union, which back then in 1850, of course, State of the Unions were not given in person like they are today. Starting with Thomas Jefferson's State of the Unions were just written out and delivered to Congress. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, I believe it was Woodrow Wilson who started the practice of giving them in person again. But he basically says to the Peruvian government, look, if you're our allies, if you're our friends, if you have a friendly disposition toward the United States, you will give us access to this this guano. But I think about the fact that you think about like in American history and world history, what did nations conquer lands for? Look at the Spanish and the conquistadors coming into Mexico. Look at other invasions throughout world history. It's treasure, it's gold, it's land, it's political power, it's all of those things. And it's that here, except the treasure is poop. That's the treasure in this case. And it may sound silly on the surface, but there's a real economic issue here because that poop was going to be used for fertilizer, which would be used to grow food, which would be used to feed nations and people. So while on the surface it may seem like, well, this is, why in the world are you going to really, the President of the United States is dealing with bird poop. The reality of it is that it was very important for the economy, not just of the United States, but the economy of the entire world.
And add to that, just to show the importance of this during the time, we have to remember most people that study history around this time and are thinking about Millard Fillmore are basically focusing on the issues that are going on within the nation that is leading up to the Civil War. But while he's battling with those domestic issues, he is also very intent on these international domestic needs for guano, and to the point that he believed so strongly in this act. He didn't just sign it and be done with it, but he believed so strongly in the act that he defended any citizen who had rights to an island by making sure that the United States Navy, the Pacific Squadron of the U.S. Navy, was given the task to enforce the right for citizens to lay claim to their islands of guano and also to safeguard their presence. So we have the United States mobilizing its Navy to allow, Ray, for you to have control of your bird poop island because that was so important. So I agree with you that this is a massive part of society during this time. And once again, people don't know about it. But it was extremely popular during the time, and we see a lot of things happening as this continues to be established. Ray, one of the other things that I would mention with this is we talked about Midway Island, but there's also this other island that's known as Palmyra. And it enjoys the curious distinction of being the only American jurisdiction outside of the 50 states and the District of Columbia, which has the United States Constitution to be followed in its entirety. And you say, well, wait a second. What about all of these other territories that are outside of the United States? We start thinking about Puerto Rico and other things. But Palmyra possesses a unique legal status because it's the only incorporated territory of the United States, which is interesting because basically it could become the 51st state if you really looked at it that way, being that it's uninhabited, all there was bird poop on it, but it has more bearing than on the unincorporated territories that don't have all the rights that are guaranteed to them by the Constitution. And there's 4, 5, 6 million American citizens living there. So this is a huge thing, especially as people are thinking about D.C. statehood and they're thinking about Puerto Rico becoming a state. We've got to think that the Guano Islands Act could become a part of the discussion because there is little Palmyra that's out there who was incorporated because of the Guano Islands Act, which gives them 100% following of the Constitution. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's an interesting story behind the story.
Yeah, you think about all the implications of what this could bring about, the Guano Islands Act. One of them was actually not off the coast of Peru, but off in the Caribbean, off the coast of Haiti with the Navassa Islands. And I'm not sure if I'm saying that name right, but in 1857, two men, one of which was a guy called Edward Cooper of Maryland, went there. And I mean, there's like 1 million tons of bird poop on that island. Had to just smell absolutely terrific. But they go there, and the Haiti government, the Haiti military sort of pushes back. And this goes all the way back to the President of the United States and the Secretary of State, who at the time was Lewis Cass. And he writes a letter to the Secretary of Navy saying this, quote, "The President, being of the opinion that any claim of the Haitian government to prevent citizens of the United States from removing guano from the island of Navassa is unfounded, directs that you will cause a competent force to repair to that island and will order the officer in command thereof to protect citizens of the United States in removing guano therefrom against any interference from authorities of the government of Haiti or any other government," end quote. And going back to Miller Fillmore, he had said as long as it wasn't claimed by any other nation. Here you had island that was claimed by another nation, Haiti. The United States disputed that claim and basically said, look, we're willing to send the military in to protect our citizens while they gather guano from that island. So it had a major, like I said a few minutes ago, you have a situation here where it may sound silly, but this was major economic stuff that nations were really willing to fight over.
Yeah, and I'm so thankful that you mentioned Navassa, because there was an incident that took place in Navassa in 1859 based on this guano retrieval. And I mean, we've already discussed, just the fact of guano being taught. It's just a nasty subject. Just in general, we have a hard time talking about it, but imagine working with it. And especially on Navassa, the working conditions were absolutely grotesque. And you would find some workers who committed suicide rather than go on with the mines of guano. And there just happened to be a American sailor on the USS Galena, which landed on Navassa and experienced what was going on. And this guy said, I don't know how anyone could do this type of work without going mad because of the overpowering stench that they were experiencing, the tropical conditions, the heat, and all that was going on. And then add to that, go back to some of the other, we go back to Columbus and the way that he treated individuals. But even here in Navassa, the managers committed these terrible abuses against the workers. They were working long hours. They weren't given the breaks that they needed. And it basically leads to a Navassa guano revolt, if you will, the riot. And I found it interesting that this guy in 1889, he comes, his name was John Ross, and you might want to mention him also, but he had been digging, he had been doing guano, and he actually goes to his boss and he says, hey man, this is just too much. This is too difficult. I've dug this hole and I'm just having a hard time. We're going to have to do something else. And that the supervisor got so mad at the guy that he kicked him back into the hole, which led another worker to take a metal bar and to hit the supervisor upside the head, knocked him silly. And what basically happens is it starts this riot, and you have this huge thing that happens. And eventually, there will be a trial that takes place on the ship. And there's murder, there's suicide, there's all of these things that are happening. And actually, some of these guys who killed some of their supervisors, the U.S. government actually had a trial for them and sentenced them to death.
Yep. And it went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court because one of the slaves, and these were slaves, by the way, out there on Navassa, you had like 130, 140 black slaves working in the poop, and then there were 11 officers, white officers, there on Guano. And one of the slaves, Henry Jones, actually appeals his death sentence, and it ends up all the way at the United States Supreme Court. And in 1890, the court found that basically the trial was legit, and I guess the death sentence stood for the murder of a guy called Thomas Foster in 1889. So again, these were very difficult conditions. Chris, I couldn't imagine, not in 100 years, working on an island full of bird poop. And you mentioned just a second ago, Chris, and our listeners couldn't see me, but I had to turn around to keep from laughing because this guy knocked the guy back into the hole, and it's like he's knocking a guy into a hole of bird poop. So, it's comical on one hand when you think about it, but then on the other hand, it's very serious stuff. I mean, murder, intrigue, militaries, U.S. Supreme Court, presidents, all getting involved in Guano.
Yeah, and it leads to the point where you mentioned that these guys basically are found guilty, they're sentenced to death, and then the media comes in, and the media starts to find out what's going on. They realize that there's a story here, and President Harrison, who comes after Fillmore a little bit later, he actually commuted the sentences of the Jones descendants that you mentioned in the defendants, that you mentioned in the Supreme Court case. Now, what's interesting is they were sentenced to death. Now, you would have thought that President Harrison might have said, look, this is terrible, I'm just going to let you go. But no, all he does is, instead of them getting the death penalty, they just get life in prison. But people continue to criticize the working conditions on Navassa. And so Harrison basically has to call the United States Navy, and they have to put federal troops on the island to ensure that there is treatment being made that is equitable, that is helpful in this. And Ray, I think it's just another sad moment in our nation's history. We're battling the concept of slavery during this time here in America, but yet we're doing some of those same things outside of America. And some people look at this whole story as a method of imperialism or expansionism. The leader of the Guano Islands Act, his name was William Seward. William Seward is also the one who purchased Alaska from the Russians. And they can see this as us just claiming territory that's outside of the United States for our own purposes. But regardless of how you see it, we're sending a message to the world that we approve of not treating individuals the right way. Even for getting purposes such as poop, as horrible a job as that could be, you still have to treat people with respect in the way that they perform that job.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is this is the first time the United States had acquired overseas territories.
Right.
And it had these humanitarian issues you're talking about. There was also environmental issues. And I think it shows that, what people do in the environment can have an impact on the environment. Because what's ultimately going to happen is the guano boom is going to go bust. One of the reasons it went bust is we used up the resource. Because what they were thinking was that as we would go in and pull the guano, more birds would come in, more poop would pile up. But what they found was in the places in the Caribbean and the Pacific where the United States and other countries were mining this guano out, the birds wouldn't return. So I'm not sure why the birds wouldn't return, but the birds would not return to the island and poop, and therefore the resource really began to run dry. And like I said, Peru, which had made a lot of money off this, hadn't really managed the situation all that well. So the wealth that had come in because of guano disappeared.
And here's the footnote to history. So, it'd be interesting to know how many of our listeners have actually heard of the Guano Islands Act because, you and I were very unfamiliar with it until just recently. And I had come across it in some discussions with some other individuals and in some of my readings. I was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea about this. I thought it was fascinating. But, here's the thing, Ray. It's still on the books.
Yeah.
And, if there's an island that's out there somewhere and it's got some guano on it, you can still pretty much go ahead and claim it. And, somebody might say, oh, that's just history. That means nothing. You can't, but actually, in 1997, someone actually tried to claim Navassa because of the so-called guano that was on there, but they wanted the island, and they were going to use the Guano Islands Act to justify this person in America actually wanting it. And there's a Supreme Court case. Once again, it's called Warren versus the United States. And basically they said, sorry, dude, you can't have the island, but the only reason you can't have the island is because in 1857, it was pretty much under the jurisdiction of the United States, and the United States hasn't given it up, and therefore, because the Islands Act says that if a nation lays claim to it, then you can't have it. So sorry, but because your country owns it, you can't have it. But right, it was somebody who I don't understand why in their right mind they wanted to try to get Navassa Island, which, by the way, is just a place full of poop. Why would you want that? But some guy wanting to be remembered in the annals of history decided that he would take a swipe at it, and look what happened.
Yeah, they also later on sort of, not only did the boom, the guano boom, drop off because of lack of replenishment, I guess we could say. It also sort of fell on hard times with farmers. I found an article in the Ogden Standard that basically said that farmers stopped using it because after 2 or 3 years, it was like it just didn't do a lot of good, and they actually said had been better off it had not been used in the first place.
Well, that was because scientists, once again, I'm thankful for scientists who want to study this stuff.
Yeah.
But what they came to find out is that Peru had the good poop. The other islands didn't have poop as good.
They were exporting their secondhand poop.
Yes, the nutrients in the other islands' poop wasn't as good as the Peruvian poop. So Peru has got something really good in store for them. They had good poop.
Yeah,
so,
there you go.
But that was the whole reason, what you're saying, that they started to really find out that, hey, it's just not doing what it used to. It's not worth the money. It's not worth the expense. It's not worth, all of the effort that goes into it. So, and then science brings forth new techniques to allow us to have the nitrogen and the other things that we need. So I just think, Ray, it's a fascinating story. This is truly one of those history you didn't know, but you really should, because you just think about it. Imagine just not sitting around the dinner table, probably not the best place for the conversation here.
No, not at
but
all.
if you really want to impress someone, you go and say, hey, did you ever hear about the time when the United States passed the Guano Islands Act? And then you've got a story to tell that I truly believe will make you the life of the party. It might take 2 attempts, but if you do it, I think you'll be really successful.
Yeah, I don't know, but it could be worth a try. I hope our listeners have enjoyed this episode, as unusual as it may have been. Chris, do you have a joke you would like to share with us?
Now, every joke that I would offer would stink at this point, so I'll just let it go.
Yeah, we'll just let it go at that. If you'd like to contact us, you can always contact us at email history you should know. That's history the letter you should know at gmail.com. You can find us on Sounder FM, Google Podcast, or Spotify. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you then.